Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Tasha Simms here with Mark Karan. You're listening to 100.5 FM in Vancouver on Co-op Radio. Conscious Living is the name of the show. We've been talking about the Vancouver International Film Festival coming really soon. I guess this Thursday is the 29th, and it's going to run until October 9th. So many incredible films. Today's conversation, we're discussing a film called Unarchived. And our filmmakers joining us, Hayley Gray, Elad Tzadok. Oh, I was like, I'm going to get it right.
You got it. It's close.
Okay. This documentary is so important. It really takes a look at how the past has been the domain of white colonial power structures. Hayley is a Vancouver-based director, writer, producer, as is Elad, and his roots from Israel. This is the world premiere of a National Film Board documentary. And again, we're going to dive right into why it's so important and how advocating for a shift, a paradigm shift in consciousness when it comes to looking at history, at our history, is so important. Welcome to the show, you two.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
So what inspired you to make Unarchived, and how's it personally important to you?
So we were lucky enough to be working with a nonprofit that worked to digitize rural and community archives. And in that work, we came across so many amazing stories of knowledge keepers really holding histories for entire towns, entire communities throughout British Columbia. And that work kind of spun into our first short documentary, Hayashi Studio, which was about a Japanese-Canadian photography studio on Vancouver Island, and how the Hayashi's lens really let you see how diverse Vancouver Island's history truly is. And from that space, we started getting into, we went back to the NFB and we were like, we have so many stories, we should make a movie about them.
I think for both of us, Hayashi was really this kind of key point for us, where I think Hayley usually tells it really well. She was aware, and we were aware of the fact that there was this historical erasure, there was this rich, diverse history all over the place, but it wasn't until we made that film where we actually got to see it, and see it in photos that are just staring right back at you. And I think that was the stepping stone into why we made this.
I certainly felt that in the film. It's one thing to even hear the stories, but then when there are visuals as well, I found it quite impactful. It was really amazing. I think too, just looking at how our dominant narrative in history tends to be one story, one opinion. And it just, it sat with me. It was quite heavy going, who decided this? How was this decided that this is the story we're going to tell? So maybe you can comment on that. And we're talking about who decides what's in the archives and what's lost.
Absolutely. I think it definitely hit home for us. You don't always think about how histories get made, but when you think, and you don't necessarily always attach that to archives, but everything from what we're taught in schools and history books to what is made in media and historical narratives is all based on what we can find in archives. What are the traditional historical records? And then when you realize that those are only just a tiny, tiny splash in the bucket of everything that was happening in that time period, you start to begin to see how much has been erased, and that it's so profound.
And when you looking back at like archiving as a profession and stuff like that, I think there's been this notion of neutrality, and you can't filter, you just collect. And what we're seeing now is kind of the backlash of what that actually meant, or the implications of that, because the reality is you can't be neutral. You can't, there's biases in every step of the way of every person in any given way. So we're currently seeing the effects of that.
Right. And, it's been said, if you don't see the past accurately, the likelihood of it being repeated increases. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. One thing that we kind of touched on in the documentary was how this current surge of anti-Asian hate is really a 100-year-old problem, and the fact that we haven't properly spoken to or documented how horrific the anti-Asian hate has been in Canada since the 1920s, since the 1910s, since the beginning of Canada, really. I think the lack of addressing that, and also the lack of valuing all of the contributions of not just the Chinese but Asian communities that and how they have created Canada and BC, really is a big piece of how we continue to perpetuate this perpetual foreigner narrative around the Chinese Canadian community.
Mhm.
Yeah, there
big
were a
thing to-
couple. Sorry, go ahead.
Another big thing to note is so much, like, we tend to think of archives as this thing that focuses on the past and the history and all that, but so much of it is really about how we decide as a society that we want to move into the future and what do we want to be. And I think that's something that gets lost.
So what I'd love to do, because you brought us into the Asian moment here, and I'd love to kind of break it down so we're not and dive in just a little deeper with each group, because I think they have a different there's a different flavor that we can talk about or share. So let's stay a little longer here with what's going on with the Asian influence. And it was, profound to see again in the film how valuable, how important the Asian community was and is. And yet there were laws, segregation laws on the books that forbid Asian people from working and all sorts of other rights, so that the state was behind this whole kind of white supremacy. I wonder how, we know that that's what it was. And now we're seeing this incredible increase in Asian hate crimes. Is it connected? How do you see it connected, or why do you think it's on the increase right now?
I think that there's a narrative in Canada that has been constructed over 150 years ago of what in the film some of the subjects call the narrative is the perpetual foreigner, in essence, where there is what is defined as us and what is defined as belongs and what is outside of that. And I think that is something that is that has affected the Chinese Canadian population, the Japanese Canadian population, as well as others.
And because of a lot of the laws that were on the books, Chinese Canadian history of immigration isn't as clear cut as white or European immigration. A lot of Chinese Canadians went back to China because their families weren't allowed to come here, because they couldn't make money, like in certain places, because they were chased out of town. So when you kind of put all those pieces together, it's really easy to tout this perpetual foreigner framework and to make these really like hateful accusations around the Chinese community, instead of understanding that the Chinese community and how they've adapted in BC is a direct result of racist legislation. Sorry.
And when you look at, when you're talking about immigration patterns and how these things are affected, there's people who are kind of observed as first or second generation, but at the same time, their family has been here for 3-4 generations, and it's the perception of that is not reflected appropriately.
Well, I think in your film, one of the people said it was literally your name. If you used your Chinese name, you're a foreigner. But you could have been here for, way longer than someone else called Jane, right? You could, like you say, 3 generations. It's amazing to me that it was only, like, I heard people I knew, not people out there, but people in my group say things, even 2-3 years ago, oh, there's no racism in Canada. It's like, wow, people. And your film really highlights it. Not only does it exist, back then for sure, but now. And that's why I think your film is so, so important to keep these conversations going. And tell us a bit more about, the Chinese Canadian Museum and why that's so valuable to have that kind of invitation to people to come and experience.
Well, the Chinese Canadian Museum is doing this incredible work right now, and they're building this museum that's going to go across the province. So they have a very unique model, which is a hub and spoke. So they're not trying to centralize themselves to a certain location. They're going all across the province because the Chinese Canadian communities have been all across the province. And I think the most interesting and fascinating and important thing here is that they're getting to tell this story themselves. They're getting to tell it from their perspective and with their voice, which up until now historically has been this outsider's perspective and this outsider's voice looking in and saying, oh, okay, this is the story we want to tell. This is the story of you. And that dynamic is shifting. And it's very fascinating to see that right now, especially with the Chinese Canadian Museum.
And the South Asian Legacy Project, which is, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the South Asian Canadian Legacy Project is a project out of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley, and it is a digital archive of South Asian stories, of South Asian video, of photos, documentation. It's really building an archive from the ground up and making it accessible worldwide, which is so huge. Their largest fund is from Paldi, which was a community, or is a community on Vancouver Island that was founded by South Asian Canadians and became one of Canada's first multicultural enclaves. And I think to your point earlier about, the general public having moments where they're like, Canada's not racist. I think what I really learned from Paldi is that multiculturalism isn't just something that is inherent to Canada from the beginning. It is something that was fought for incredibly hard and worked for and built by communities like Paldi that saw the white supremacy in Canada and decided that they wanted to do something different.
I love that. I mean, it made it real going. And I thought, how come I don't know about this? How do I not know about Paldi? It's like, maybe describe what the climate was in that town. It was the Cowichan Valley, but the climate was so beautiful in terms of how people were relating and the different cultures. Can you just touch on that? Paint a picture for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a mill town founded in the 1910s. And it, once again, as I said, it started by South Asian Canadians, but it quickly became this place where the Chinese community, the Japanese community, the European community, and the South Asian community were all working together. Kids were going to school and playing together. They were in and out of the Gurdwara together. When you talk to people who grew up in Paldi, they just are so animated about what a euphoric and beautiful childhood it was, and being able to run into like anybody's kitchen, and in one kitchen you're getting sticky rice, and in the other you're getting roti, and the other you're getting somebody's ham sandwich, and growing up with kind of a little bit of all those different cultures and really feeling like that was the normal for their lives. And it was just it's so lovely to hear them speak about it. It's really, really beautiful.
I think too, what do you think the impact on identity is for these groups that are marginalized or racialized, who have been vanquished, from our history books in terms of identity? What do you think the impact is?
I mean, when you don't see your history reflected in museums and archives and stuff like that, two things happen. You start creating this subconscious notion of, oh, I don't belong there. I don't see myself in these spaces, therefore these spaces are not for me. And it changes your sense of belonging, not just to that, but to the society you're within at large.
Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. I think that Dr. Satwinder Baines puts it really well in the documentary, where if it becomes clear that you're not valued and your histories aren't valued, then it's hard to see yourself as someone of value. And there's so many stories we hear from knowledge keepers where at the end, they're like, I don't know why you'd want to hear from me anyway. And it's this like, internalized devaluing that is
Right.
definitely a piece of the white supremacy that has been such a big piece of Canada's history.
It's like, why are you talking to me? My story doesn't matter. I'm not important. And
Right.
the reality is trying to get these pictures of the communities that were here, the stories of what was here. Everybody's story is important. Like your grandmother's story is important. All those things that are tucked away in the basement, all those books of photos and albums and everything are incredibly important to create this portrait of a community, of a town, of a culture, of all these things.
I think it's, oh no, I've lost my thought completely. No, it's gone. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a sense of we-ness when everyone's included, and when any particular group isn't, it's us and them. It creates this division that we're seeing so rampant in the world everywhere, globally, not just here, obviously, or the States, but everywhere. It's almost like our thinking has become polarized, and yet the idea that everyone's story is important and has value is such an inclusive, we creating energy. It's really quite, I honestly, I think it's, even in terms of the planet and the environment, it's the way of the future. If we're not doing we, if we're doing I mean, it's over. That time is done. We just can't, we're not going to survive a whole bunch of I's. Do you agree?
100%.
100%. Yeah, I think something that strikes both of us when we see things like Hayashi's photos or the beautiful footage that they have from Paul D is that, like, this is one place that was documented, but there are so many histories in BC, so many Chinese, Japanese, South Asian communities that didn't have a photographer or someone with a Super 8 camera, and they were still there. They were still making that history, and it does make you realize that these experiences are, to a certain extent, universal.
How did you approach making this film? Because there were some things you did that were quite unique.
Well, yeah. I think going off of what we said earlier, that archives and museums are not about the past, they're about the future. We wanted to make sure that the film felt energetic, contemporary, and relevant. Like it's about the activism that we all collectively need to do right now to help shift the narrative. And we had this phenomenal animator and motion graphics designer who came on board to do a lot of our visual sequences and use a lot of the archival material that we were able to get a hold of in these unique tactile ways of just ripping stuff away and piecing things together.
Yeah, we really wanted it to feel, to Elad's point, like modern and fresh, and not like a sleepy documentary, like something that just engages you and pulls you in from the get-go. And archives also can be fun and amazing and are full of like hilarious and poignant and heartbreaking and heartful things. So having that kind of engagement was really important for us.
And I love that you brought your shooting crew on board from the communities that you were collecting the stories from. Tell us more about that, because that's unique and quite lovely.
Absolutely. We were really intentional about wanting our full shooting crew to be reflective of the communities that we were a part of. So we'd worked with Kayla Wachel on a number of projects, our cinematographer, and we're lucky enough to bring her on this one again. We were lucky to get 2 members of the Tahltan Nation to come make this movie with us, the Birkin brothers, both Mike Birkin and Ramsey Birkin.
Yeah, they were both fantastic. And we brought in,
and everyone from our PAs to our sound mixers were all community members, and that I think really helped us think about things in a different light, because you're spending your time traveling with these people, chatting with them about the project, and it definitely informed the questions we were asking, the way we were shooting, and all those different pieces.
Everybody brings so much of themselves to every project that they come on board, and being able to have all these different pluralities of voices and ideas contributing to the mix and being able to collectively put that together into the film that this is, I think made it what it is.
Absolutely.
How many people did you interview? Did you kind of
Oh,
keep
I
track?
haven't even kept track. I think there's like 15, maybe, not
Yeah, I
including
think
like
probably 15.
the
That's
entire Poldy.
we're gonna say, oh yeah, everybody from Paldi too, then it's probably actually more like
30.
30. I think we probably interviewed
Right.
30 people.
Yeah.
Most
Did,
of them made it into the movie though, which is great.
Mhm.
Yeah.
did you consider, or did it even occur, this idea of when people go to tell their stories, that safety is the word I want to bring into the equation? Because some of the stories are horrific. Some of the stories are not easy to tell, and some of them can be re-traumatizing even. Was it a consideration for you, safety? And if so, what did you do to ensure that?
Absolutely. I think part of the reason we settled on these 4 stories was because we had that in mind. There are so many more stories out there and so many more communities that we don't get to talk to in the film. And that's safety was a big part of that.
Absolutely. And also some of those communities are just beginning their archives and just beginning that story of history. And so letting them kind of have that space to figure out how they want to speak to it was a huge factor. But yeah, we definitely were, when we were thinking about who to interview and then how we wanted to go about it, it was really important to make sure that there were people and communities that were excited to share their story on a larger platform, where that was like the right time and place for them to do that.
And felt comfortable doing so. Yeah.
Yeah, and also wanted to speak to, yeah, absolutely, in a
Mhm.
larger way.
Mhm. What was the biggest surprise you discovered in terms of BC's history? Was there something that you didn't know, and making this film, collecting the stories, talking to people kind of brought to light for you?
Interesting question.
I don't think I knew the intensity and the what's the word? I didn't know how many details there were and how many things to think about when it came to the Royal BC Museum.
Mhm.
There's just so many facets of how to go about decolonizing and trying to create more efficacy in that space that are just enormous to consider. And thinking about trying to build a new museum if that does end up happening. And then also just the amount of time and labor and humans it takes to make repatriation happen
Mhm.
was huge.
Yeah.
Let's dig in a little bit more there, and then Elad, you can answer the same question. But I just want to talk about the museum since you just brought it to the table. They were accused of racism and discrimination. Can you say a little bit about that and what's going on right now?
I think what we know is mostly what's in the news about that, which is that their CEO stepped down because of allegations of racism, and that there were more departures that followed quite quickly after that, and that there's been investigative work done on that. And the other piece that we know is that it was taking up to 2 years for people to get a response from the repatriations department because they were so incredibly swamped and understaffed
And backlogged
with requests. Yeah.
But I think the reality is that there were systemic issues that come from how these organizations and how the legislation behind them has worked for years and decades. And what we're seeing is the manifestation of that. So I think what we've discovered is that a lot of people, both inside and out, want to see a lot of these changes enacted, and are working very hard to do so. It just, systems are hard to move,
They're
and
incredibly hard to change. I think that was a big piece of us
Yeah.
going into this documentary is I think that collectively, I think the public understands more that there is a problem with how histories are framed, but how to actually go about changing those histories is such a huge and mind-boggling task. And so getting to see some of these different communities and the different ways that they're approaching it, I hope gives other museums, the public, archives, all sorts of spaces something to think about when it comes to how they're going to approach that.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things that I think we got to see, or got people to speak up to, is the intervention that the South Asian community was able to do at the RBCM, where they were invited in to put sticky notes and to talk about, here's all these various places where we exist,
Where
we
South
were
Asians
there,
contributed.
we contributed, we built this province by all these means, but we're not seen, we're
Mhm.
not reflected.
Mhm.
And I think that goes to illustrate and show what work is being done and the direction that we hope the needle is pointing.
So, what is the new framework if you were to have a magic wand and wave it? And I'm not asking, obviously, it's complicated on multiple levels, but I get the feeling that you've got an idea of the direction we need to move towards beyond museums just holding all these chosen artifacts. Or, I mean, there are photos there without names, and those names could be found, et cetera. There could be more ongoing. But I'm curious to hear if you were to look at, especially in terms of the colonial system and all these institutions that still need to look at themselves and begin to change and dissolve some of the systems in place. What's your take on it? What is the new framework as you see it?
I don't think there's one answer. I think there's multiple different directions that could be taken and multiple different things that need to happen. I think legislation is a huge part of it. I think funding various community organizations is another. And I think empowering communities to tell their own stories is a huge factor, and working in collaboration with them and genuine collaboration with them is what's going to take us to the next step.
Absolutely.
So inviting the communities that want to be archived to be involved in the process of how to make that happen. Is that what you're saying?
That, and giving them the opportunity to do it their own way.
And what about giving back the things that were taken to the museum, the things that
Absolutely.
belong?
Yeah, I think that's number one. How and when and what processes they're going to do that is a whole other. APTN's done a fantastic job documenting that, though.
Mhm.
Is there resistance to that?
How do I explain that? I think the process is colonial and how they're trying to let it go, and so it's very hard to figure out if there's not another business entity, how can they bring it back? There's a lot of bureaucracy that is.
I think,
troubling that.
yeah, I think there's a lot of goodwill, but a lot of bureaucratic hoops.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of this is kind of getting stuck and failing.
Right. So it makes it a slow kind of process.
Yeah.
Let's touch on, is there more around Indigenous? Because that also is very profound in the movie with the Taltan and some of the revelations that they were having as they were looking. I wonder if you can just comment and say a little bit about that portion of the story.
Can you be a little more specific?
Well, just I remember her, as they're watching the footage, recognizing, just the emotional impact of the process of finding footage that reflects your heritage, your ancestors,
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
process. And it was cool that she was able to have that footage, because there was a moment in the film I'm going, is it going to be again, the bureaucracy goes, no, you can't. But wasn't her uncle, but I can't recall who it was.
I think she was related to the woman on the who
Mhm.
was singing on the video. Yeah. And then her grandmother was on the other
Yeah.
one. Absolutely.
I mean, these are
think
your
that-
relatives, your ancestors. It's like,
and
Yeah.
you should, and you need to have access.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sandra has such a positive take on that, which is that like these are her ancestors coming back to her, and there's just been so many beautiful coincidences and how she's been able to find these videos. We ran into one and were able to connect her with one as well. And I think that speaks to, for Sandra, that is her ancestors ready to come home.
Yeah, lovely. And let's look at our history here with queer, trans. Um, I mean, the character in your film, Roy, collected everything, right? He didn't actually have an agenda. He just kept it all in his apartment. Maybe tell everyone a little bit about that story and how amazing it is that it's actually being offered to the world now.
Yeah, Ron is an incredible force of nature. He's prolific in Vancouver for collecting and documenting the queer history here since the early 70s. And he's just been going at it nonstop to the point where it took over his entire apartment. And he's to the point, and then he had to move it to the to the Vancouver archives. Yeah.
Which was a moment for him, right? In the film. Like
Absolutely,
it was kind of you're giving your this collection of everything. You're trusting a government, a body that at one point, I mean, we can't forget that in history it was a criminal, it was considered criminal to be gay, or a mental illness, or I mean, there was so, so much stigma. And he actually was that a big moment for him to actually hand that over? I can only imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think safety was such a big part of that, and especially giving it to a government organization. And so I know that there was a lot of conversations about how it would be handled, how it would be tagged and documented, and the autonomy of the community to have ownership and access to those documents and photos and all of the different pieces of the archive.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard thing to balance because I think a lot of community archives end up in larger institutions because there is that they stand the test of time slightly longer than a West End apartment, but at the same time there are certain things that you have to balance with that, because a lot of them haven't been safe, especially for the LGBTQ community, for a really long time.
They're being digitalized though, yes, and available online, which is also becomes a whole other thing where people can access and relate to themselves in a different way, right?
accessibility becomes a huge point.
Mm-hmm. You said something really cool. I think in the film, you paralleled our view of history as the Wizard of Oz, saying once you see the man behind the curtain, it reveals how we have been perpetuating a very limited experience. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think kind of speaking to what we said earlier, and what you said earlier, when you realize that history, as it's been written in books, is just this one, is, not just one race's or gender's opinion, but like a very few amount of people were writing those histories and putting them down. And then when you start to see all the other things that were happening at the same time that didn't get spoken to, or, side characters in that history that have their whole other piece that they would like to be speaking to as their own, protagonists in their own stories, you really begin to understand that history is this huge pluralist thing, and that we are only beginning to scratch the surface on everything that's happened and will continue to happen.
Is there anything we can do, each individual, to facilitate greater understanding around this area? Anything you can think of?
Collect all of your family stories, collect all of your friends and everybody's stories, and then go visit your archives.
And not just your local archives, but
Yeah.
also all of the these community archives, the Jewish Community Archive, the Black library that just started in Vancouver, the South Asian Studies Institute. There's so many places to learn from.
Yeah,
I love that. Well, massive change hopefully coming with all institutions taking a look at what they've got, and all of us working together to move towards more inclusivity and awareness and accuracy, right? So important. So the film is, are you attending the film? You're going to do a Q&A and all that? So there'll be a conversation. So September 30th and October 2nd are the two dates. It's also available on VIFF Connect, which means people could be in their jammies at home and watching as well. I really recommend seeing the film. Any final thoughts or anything we didn't cover that would be important for you to get across to the listener?
No, I
No,
think
just
that's
hope to
all.
see you on Friday at the
Yeah.
premiere.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We've been speaking with the filmmakers of Unarchived about the importance of hearing all the stories from multiple viewpoints in order to get a richer, more accurate perspective of our history. And again, do see the film at VIFF. You've got a couple of dates. I'm going to leave you with a quote from the film. I really loved this one. The process of silencing makes a lot of noise. So I say, let's make even more noise as we bring whatever it is that has occurred to the light. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tasha Simms, and you can catch the show 100.5 FM Wednesday nights, 6 to 7 p.m. Conscious Living Radio.